before we get into it, I wanted to call your attention to section 206 in Golden Gaze Introduction. I think this is just a really helpful way of framing your reading of the Bible that you're doing this week as well. So he's got a bunch of questions here as you're reading Genesis 1 through 11. I think that would be great for you to go through that, because I don't want to be the one telling you all the stuff on these videos. I want you to be the one seeing it within the pages of Scripture. Also, we're going to spend most of our time nerding out over scholarly stuff, but I don't want that to be divorced from your theological conclusions that are coming from the text. So use Golden Gaze questions to help sort of inspire some of your thinking, and those questions come out of 2.6, if that makes sense to you. Second part of the book, sixth section of the book. So here we go. In the last video, I introduced some of the reasons why scholars think that Genesis 1:1 through 2:4a and Genesis 2:4b through the end of chapter 3, why they come from different sources. They have different styles. They have different names for the divine. They have different themes that they're pushing. There is a different order to creation in both of these stories. They espouse a different theology, a different depiction of God. If you're new to this, it's a little overwhelming. But what's good about this example is what we have are two narrative traditions that stand side by side. You have an entire narrative tradition of creation in Genesis 1, followed by another contradictory creation narrative in Genesis 2 through 3. And they're just both there for you to see the differences. Now, we also have an example of a different sort in the primeval history of how this source theory might work. It's in the story of the flood. And I'm not sure if you've noticed this, but a cursory reading of the flood story feels like a compilation of two competing sources. I say I'm not sure if you've noticed this because I have a hunch. I think that most of us rely on our knowledge about this story, and we don't usually read it closely. Hopefully we overcome that this week as you're diving into Genesis 1 through 11, but we certainly don't preach from this passage. It's a long story, it's 4 chapters, it's a weird story, it's a difficult story, but for the most part, we rely on whatever knowledge we have from our Sunday school days and we import that back onto the text. But if you look at it closely, it feels like it starts and stops, like there's glitches, like the printer screwed up somewhere. For example, in the early portions of the story, it introduces wickedness. It says, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually." That's in Genesis 6, verse 5. Now, later, it says something very similar. "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight." Note that, right? So in the first text, it was the Lord sees the wickedness. And in this second passage, it says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth." So you've got these two different lines that say pretty much the same thing, that have two different names for the divine. And it's almost like when you're reading it, you get through this, and you're like, okay, that makes sense. And then you get to this one, 7 verses or so later, and you're like, wait, didn't I just read that? Why is this coming up again? There's also divergences within the story. Things like the animals. Just off the top of your head, how many animals go into the boat? Yeah, 2 by 2, right? There's pairs, and maybe you flash back to, "And God told Noah there's gonna be a floody." I grew up in the church, people, and I have stories from long ago. Hold on. I have this right on the floor next to me. This is a flannel graph for teaching Daniel in the lion's den. So, that's my world. Maybe you started singing that too. Okay, but anyway, you know that there's 2 of each animal going into the boat, or at least you think you know. So the way the story's told, it says, "And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kinds, and the animals according to their kinds, and of every creeping thing." It just keeps on going. There's 2 of every kind. That's the point. And then a little bit later it says, "Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean." So, okay, whoa. So in one section it's take a pair of every animals, male and female, and then later it says take 7 pairs of clean animals, and then take just 1 pair of unclean animals. And it goes on to say something about the need for sacrifice, which is weird because sacrifice hasn't been introduced yet in the story. We also have divergences about the rain. It says that it fell for 40 days and 40 nights in chapter 7, verse 12. And then later on it says the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days in chapter 7, verse 24. You might think, well, it rained for 40 days and then the waters stayed around for 150 days. Maybe, sort of. But you've got all these other sort of divergences that are causing problems for that. You also have the bit about when Noah sends out the birds at the end of the story. It says here at the end of 40 days, not 150, but at the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent out a raven. And the raven, it goes to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Now that on its own, it could be self-contained because you have Noah at the end of 40 days sending out a bird. It's a raven, and the raven goes back and forth until the raven notices that the waters are dried up and he can go about being on the earth, okay? And then right after that it says, then he sends out the dove to see if the waters had subsided. But the dove found no place to set its foot, and it returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the earth. So he brought out his hand and took it and brought it into the ark with him. So you've got in one story a raven that goes back and forth until the earth is dry, and then in another story you've got Noah sending out a dove and it comes back, and then later, as you know, the dove doesn't come back, and from that Noah deduces that there must be dry ground. So you've got these different things that are happening that seem to conflict with one another if you allow yourself to go there. Here's the interesting thing. If you go through this entire story, you can pretty easily divide it into 2 separate sources based on the repetitions in the text and the conflicting details and the use of the divine name, whether it's Elohim or Yahweh. So now we're starting to see something totally different. We're starting to see sources that have been brought together to form one story. But when you separate them and when you read them on their own, what you end up with is 2 nearly self-contained flood stories. You could preach these, okay, just as its own entity versus the other entity. You could preach these in 2 consecutive weeks. I don't think you should do that, but you could. It's actually pretty wild. And John Collins, in your introduction, does a nice job of setting this out side by side. He's got J's account and he's got P's account. Those letters will mean something to you in a minute here. Now, this sort of work where you're isolating and you're identifying potential sources is called source criticism. And it's occupied a great deal of energy and ink within Old Testament scholarship, specifically in the 19th century, but it's continued to present. In very simplistic terms, what people saw at work in things like the creation story and how the 2 are set side by side, or how the flood story seems to be incorporating 2 separate sources, they began to wonder how far they might take this. And as you can imagine, it turned out to be quite a process. What resulted is known as the documentary hypothesis. It was popularized by a German scholar named Julius Wellhausen. He didn't come up with the theory, but he popularized the theory. He made it accessible for people. And he put together a good initial synopsis of what scholars believed constituted the Pentateuch. And this is what he proposed. He identified 4 sources. I say he identified. He compiled the 4 different sources that other people had identified, and this is what they're named. You have the J source. Remember, this is a German sort of philosophy, so in German, Yahweh is spelled with a J, so the J source is known as the Yahwist. This source supposedly tells a continuous story from Genesis 2 in the time of the Garden of Eden to Israel's near emergence in the Promised Land in the book of Numbers. It's often dated to the 10th century, and you can link this source with the so-called Solomonic Enlightenment. Scholars also postulate the origin of this source in Jerusalem or Judah in the south. Part of this is going to be important for you to remember. For much of Israel's history, there's actually 2 kingdoms, Judah in the south, Israel in the north. So you've got the J source, which originates supposedly in the south around the 10th century. Then you have the E source. The E source is named the Elohist source. And as you can imagine, this is because the divine name in that source is often Elohim. People argue about whether or not the E source is a continuous document or if it merely supplements the J tradition, but we're not going to enter into that discussion. For our purposes, you can think of the E source as a northern document to complement J, which is a southern document. It's associated with Ephraim, the capital of the northern tribes of Israel. And it's traditionally dated a little bit later than J, so like the 9th century or so. It's complementing J, and again, scholars disagree on that. So you have J, the Yahwist, E, the Elohist, and D, the Deuteronomist. For E's, the D source is linked with the book of Deuteronomy, and it's often believed to have some relationship to the Torah scroll that's found during the reign of King Josiah in 622 BC, some form of that. John Goldengay says it had perhaps been written in the previous century, but people date this differently. For E's, though, think about D as Deuteronomy. So now J, E, D, and D is much later. 7th century or so. You've got J in the 10th century, you've got E in the 9th century, you've got D in the 7th century, maybe. And then the P source, which is the priestly source. Genesis 1 is part of the priestly source because it's so ordered and it's so strategically placed, and because it cares about things like the Sabbath. It's got like this priestly focus, right? And it tells the same story, the P source does, as the J source, but it does so in a very different way with very different motivations. Again, concerned with ancient Israelite religion and priestly procedures. J, E, D, and P. At the time of Wellhausen, P was the last source, although people don't really agree with that anymore. So as it was explained by the early source theorists, these 4 sources were then combined by a redactor or an editor into the version that we have of the Pentateuch now, and this took place sometime after the exile. As you can imagine, source theories have ballooned since the dawn of the 20th century. In fact, I was listening to a podcast this past week where the guest, Richard Elliott Friedman, he surmised that no less than 25 authors were involved in the Pentateuch. I'll post that podcast link in the bonus material so you can take a listen if you want. It actually complements what we're talking about here pretty nicely. Also, just if you care, Friedman wrote a book called Who Wrote the Bible that lays this out in a pretty accessible way as well. Now, here's a good response to this, I think. Moses did not write the Pentateuch. It's really hard to deny the presence of source material in the Pentateuch, and I'm not sure that you need to do that. But also identifying who did and how many there were and when they wrote, those questions are nearly impossible to answer. So I don't think that you should lose much sleep over identifying which proposed source document is behind a certain verse in the Pentateuch, but on a broader level, there's some really meaningful theological payoff for thinking about how the Bible was composed, and allowance for the use of sources in that compilation, and allowance for editors redacting these sources, and allowance for the Bible incorporating a process of gathering traditions into what we now have. I think that says something about how God works, and it's actually pretty cool. So you've got all these different traditions, and God at different points is bringing them together in different ways for different purposes. It's almost like it's implying the Bible speaks. It spoke then for the traditions of those people. It speaks now as it's gathered, and it continues to speak as people read it in different contexts. It's beautiful. So I know this stuff can be weird and scary at first, but when you get past that and you allow yourself to see the theological connections, it can actually be quite beautiful.